Hello and welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host as always, Marcus Sidhu, and today we are chatting all about coffee. And I recently wrote an article on coffee, but I find that folks like to consume information in different ways. So I thought I'd put a podcast together on it as well. Now, I want to address one specific caveat before we get started. It's essentially impossible to separate coffee and caffeine. So for the sake of this podcast, we're going to address them as synonymous terms. So if I say coffee, I also mean caffeine, and then vice versa, unless I specifically mention otherwise. So first up here, caffeine is a drug. It alters our state, but how exactly does it work? So over the course of the day, a substance called adenosine builds up in the brain, and it makes you feel sleepy. And it turns out that caffeine actually blocks this stuff called adenosine, and therefore has you feel more alert. It's fairly simple stuff. Now, you might be thinking, well, if adenosine builds up over the course of the day, wouldn't it make more sense to consume coffee in the afternoon or the evening? And technically, yes, that's true, but we all know that caffeine is an alerting substance, so if it's consumed too late, it'll interfere with sleep, which we obviously don't want because sleep is vitally important. Now, most of us drink coffee in the morning, and being that adenosine is lowest in the morning and builds up throughout the day, like we mentioned, the caffeine that we consume in the morning is actually even more alerting. So it elevates mood, energy, sense of well-being even more than it would later in the day when adenosine is at higher concentrations. So as the day goes on, caffeine concentration in the blood is filtered out, and simultaneously adenosine climbs back up, and that's how we're able to get a good night's rest. Now, it's worth mentioning that the more caffeine you consume, the longer it takes for your body to filter it out, and enter the concept of half-life. This is really simple, so let me give you an example. The half-life of caffeine in the body, on average, is about 6 hours. So some folks genetically metabolize it faster, and then other folks break it down a lot slower. But we're going to take the average person for our example, so we'll use 6 hours as our example here. A regular cup of coffee has about 100 to 200 milligrams of caffeine, give or take, depending on how strong it is. But let's say it's a stronger cup, so 200 milligrams. 6 hours after finishing your cup of coffee, you're going to have 100 milligrams of caffeine swirling around in your blood because half of 200 milligrams leaves us with 100 milligrams. Now, 6 hours after that, you're going to have 50 milligrams floating around in your blood because half of 100 is 50. And then 6 hours after that, you're going to have 25 milligrams swirling around in your blood, and so on. That's the concept of half-life. That's just what it means. It means that every 6 hours, the amount of caffeine floating around in your blood is going to half. So your personal tolerance to caffeine can be scaled up or down to a degree by consuming more or less. So if you start drinking a bunch of coffee, your tolerance to caffeine will climb. And then if you eliminate it or drink a lot less for an amount of time, you'll become more sensitive to it. But your overall personal genetic tolerance doesn't really change as far as we know. Now, lastly, around tolerance, some people claim that caffeine doesn't affect them. So in other words, they can drink a coffee right before bed and fall asleep no problem. Typically, this is the case because these folks are dealing with so much sleep debt that the caffeine can't overcome, and therefore they drink a coffee and still get right to sleep. This isn't really a good thing because really often these folks who say that caffeine doesn't impact them are shift workers. So parents with young children, police officers, firefighters, nurses, etc. Essentially folks who have super funky sleep schedules and their circadian rhythms are all over the place, and therefore the caffeine or coffee doesn't touch their sleep debt and they're able to fall asleep. But if they were all caught up on their sleep and they had a regular circadian rhythm and regular sleep schedule, the caffeine would actually impact them the way that it was meant to as an alerting substance. Now, potential benefits here. It can enhance cognition. Like I mentioned above, if we suppress adenosine and feel more alert, we're going to enhance our cognitive capabilities via focus, mental clarity, etc. Second, it can increase power output. So when you increase energy levels, you may be slightly stronger or faster or whatever. Performance can, go up to a small degree when you consume caffeine, potentially. Thirdly, it may help burn body fat. There is a slight short-term thermogenic effect via heat production and to a lesser degree, a release of fatty acids into the bloodstream to be used for fuel. But honestly, I wouldn't even count the fat-burning element of coffee consumption because it's just really small. It's pretty insignificant. And especially if you're drinking it in any other way than black or with 0-calorie sweetener, because if you're adding even a splash of milk, cream, sugar, syrup, etc. It's just adding calories to your daily intake that the potential fat-burning benefits of coffee or caffeine wouldn't outweigh. It's just that small. Now, potential downsides, blood pressure. It can increase blood pressure acutely, meaning for about 4 hours, give or take, but in the big picture, this isn't really anything to write home about. Digestion issues. Some folks don't tolerate coffee or caffeine well from a digestion standpoint. And if you're one of those folks, you'll know the most common side effect is diarrhea, and it happens quite rapidly. Acid reflux. Some people tend to get reflux or heartburn after consuming coffee. And again, you'll know if this is you because the feedback is fairly immediate. Sleep can take a hit for folks who have a low tolerance and or time their intake too close to bedtime. 12 p.m. noon seems to be a pretty good coffee cutoff for most people. Now, it's worth noting that if you add things like milk, cream, syrups, and other funky sweeteners to your coffee, you may actually be reacting negatively digestion and reflux-wise to those things that you're adding into your coffee and not necessarily the coffee or caffeine itself. So in order to square this away and find out what's impacting you, simply try having straight up black coffee and see how you do with that without the add-ons of the milk, cream, syrups, etc. And then another thing to keep in mind is that if you drink something like a pre-workout supplement or an energy drink, the caffeine in those drinks is different from the caffeine in coffee because it's actually synthesized in the lab. The stuff in the pre-workout supplements, the energy drinks, tends to hit you a little bit harder. So chances are you won't need as much from those products to get the same buzz that you would from a coffee, for example. So just something to be aware of so you can avoid that jittery feeling because it's not fun. Now, take-home points. The first place to start is to assess how you digest coffee personally. If the answer is not well, it's a good idea to skip it. Also, if it impacts your sleep in any negative way, it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul. That's just not sustainable. And good sleep is going to both give you more energy in the long term, and it's just much more important to your overall health. So prioritize that. If it's solely the caffeine that you don't do well with, i.e. you get the jitters and you feel a little anxious, feel free to go for decaf. It should solve that problem. Personally, I have a couple cups of regular coffee in the morning, and then I often go for a decaf black Americano in the afternoon because I love the way it tastes. I really like cafes, and I really enjoy just slowing down for a half hour or so midday and, smelling the roses, quote unquote. The reason I go for regular in the morning and decaf in the afternoon is because both having too much caffeine and having it too late in the day messes with my sleep quality. So I prioritize sleep, and therefore I go for a caffeinated coffee in the morning and then a decaf one in the afternoon. Now, coffee is a fat loss friendly beverage because it contains virtually no calories. It's about 5 calories per cup, give or take. So if you consume it black or with 0-calorie sweetener, that's going to be a fat loss friendly beverage, of course. However, if you add any milk, cream, sugar, syrups, even the sugar-free syrup, actually, it contains calories. It's got sugar alcohols. It's got less calories than regular table sugar, for example, but it still contains calories. You're just adding to your overall caloric load for the day, so just be aware of that. And then lastly, coffee does do a pretty darn good job of crushing appetite. And it's not only the caffeine itself that diminishes appetite, it seems, and cravings, but even decaf has this effect. So as you get leaner and leaner, potentially hunger becomes more of an issue. So decaf coffee is a great way to crush that hunger, particularly in the mid to late afternoon when cravings tend to kick up a little for some folks. But again, make that decaf because we want to make sure that we're getting quality sleep at night. That's it, guys. Quick episode on coffee today, and I hope you got something from that episode. If so, you can always review the podcast on iTunes. That would be amazing. It's a great way for the podcast to grow and reach more folks. Or even just email the link to a friend or family member that you think might benefit from the information. And again, thanks for listening, and I will catch you guys on the next episode. See ya.